listener production.
Hello, Sasha Barbagat with you for today's episode of The Briefing. This week, the federal government released its first National Autism Strategy. It details plans to better the lives of people living with autism spectrum disorder in Australia through 4 key points: social inclusion, economic inclusion, diagnosis, services and support, and health and mental health. On today's deep dive, we're seeking to better understand just how hard it is to be autistic in Australia and why this strategy is so desperately needed.
It's not that autistic people don't want to engage, but they have difficulty engaging in the usual way. So making adjustments so that they can engage in the workplace and can contribute in the workplace is really important. And yes, that is a focus in this National Autism Strategy, which is just great to see.
That chat coming up in the second half of today's episode. First, here are the headlines with Katrina Blowers. It is Thursday, April 4.
Hello, Sasha. Hi, everyone. Well, 2 former heads of World Central Kitchen have questioned whether the strike that hit and killed 7 aid workers in Gaza, including an Australian, was in fact unintentional, which is what Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying. He has been saying that it was a case of misidentification, which happened at night, and it was a mistake. But the founder of World Central Kitchen, Jose Andre, has accused Israeli forces in Gaza of systematically targeting the cars of aid workers, while another former head, Nate Mook, has said he finds it very, very hard to believe that Israeli forces didn't know about the presence of the aid workers. Nate Mook has said he believes more aid agencies will pull out as a result of the strike.
This is a tragedy, not just for the aid community, not just for the families of those we've lost, but, this is a tragedy for the people of Gaza and really for the world.
The UN is suspending its overnight operations in Gaza for at least 48 hours to evaluate security. It comes, Sasha, as Zomi Frankham, who was the Australian who was killed in this strike, her family have put out a statement saying that Zomi would have been just devastated if she knew that her death would lead to any kind of stoppage of aid to people in Gaza.
And Zomi's body has now been transported out of the Gaza Strip ahead of being flown home. The bodies of the 5 other foreign aid workers are also being repatriated. Meanwhile, the White House National Security spokesperson has said the US doesn't expect the Israeli strike to affect talks on a ceasefire and the release of hostages. Discussions have stalled after a flurry of activity leading up to Ramadan. There had been hopes that there would be a ceasefire agreement in place before March 10, but that deadline passed and we still haven't reached one. Qatar, who is facilitating the talks, says the obstacles are the same as those back in February. And the Hamas demand for displaced Palestinians to be able to return to all parts of Gaza remains a major sticking point. Rescue efforts are continuing in Taiwan, where a 7.4 magnitude earthquake struck, injuring at least 900 people and killing at least 9. It's believed 127 people are trapped in tunnels and on mountainous roads along the country's rugged coastline after the quake hit yesterday morning, which triggered landslides. It is the strongest tremor Taiwan has felt in 25 years. And we also saw the earthquake trigger tsunami warnings for islands in Japan and the Philippines, but they were later cancelled, Katrina.
Yeah, Taiwan's Foreign Office has issued a statement on X expressing thanks for the offers of aid from allies and friends like Japan and Paraguay. It interestingly also thanked China for its concern, but said there would be no request for assistance from that side. Beijing, of course, claims sovereignty of the self-governed island, which sees itself as distinct from China. Mediation talks between Linda Reynolds and Brittany Higgins have failed, with a defamation trial to go ahead. The former Defence Minister is suing her former staffer over social media posts she made, which Reynolds claims damaged her reputation. That matter is set down for WA's Supreme Court in July, so still plenty to report about in this space.
And it comes as a separate defamation trial in which Bruce Lerman is suing Channel 10 and Lisa Wilkinson reopens today to hear new evidence. We were supposed to get the ruling from Justice Michael Lee today, but now there's going to be more evidence. Now, this week, the judge accepted an 11th hour bid by 10 to hear new evidence from this former Channel 7 producer who has claimed in an affidavit that Lerman was behind leaks of Higgins's private text messages, as well as a recording of a meeting with Lisa Wilkinson and another 10 producer. His name is Taylor Albach, and his affidavit goes on to say that Seven footed the bill for sex workers and illicit drugs for Lerman while the network was courting him for an interview on its Spotlight program, but those allegations are yet to be tested in court.
And it's been a week of some pretty rough news. So we've been having a look around and we're going to end on an animal story, something so much lighter and brighter. Now, this one is out of Queensland about the most unlikely of best friends. An Instagram famous magpie and a staffy are a step closer to being reunited after the magpie was seized by local authorities last month. Now, Molly the Maggie and Peggy the Pooch became besties after the dog's parents rescued the magpie when it fell out of its nest in a dog park in 2020 when it was a baby. Their unlikely friendship saw them go viral on social media. The only problem is it is illegal to take and keep a native animal without a license. So the Department of Environment stepped in. They seized this magpie last month, Sasha, but then it's kind of crazy because you try and get, the Premier, and I'm sure you do in New South Wales as well, to comment on various things. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But Stephen Miles actually weighed in on this one. Maybe he follows them on Instagram. He voiced his support for Molly to return to the only home he's known, even though Molly sounds like a girl's name. This magpie is a boy. Confusing. Molly's adoptive family have now been contacted by Queensland's Environment Department. So there we go.
Step closer. Yeah, that sounds like they're making progress in this. Peggy's owners are still hopeful they'll be able to bring her friend home soon. And there is a change.org petition that is in support of that. It's just shy of 150,000 signatures. This has really got people riled up. I think, I actually follow these guys. I have my own magpie thing during lockdown. It was really weird. I lived in Victoria at the time, and I had all these magpies coming to my house, and people called me the magpie lady. It was really strange. But I found Molly and Peggy during that time, and I really related to how smart and intuitive and engaging these birds can be. That people are scared of them, but they're really amazing animals. I was really drawn to this story of Peggy and Molly, and I was really sad when I saw this news come out. So today I saw this update that they've actually had this call from the Queensland Environment Department. So hopefully they're going to be reunited.
Well, all they have to do is do a course to keep a wild bird. So presumably that's just like, something very short and quick. But it blows my mind that so much red tape has had to occur to get this to happen, and that the Premier has had to intervene. But here we are.
Yeah, exactly. Katrina, thank you for being with us for the headlines today. Next up is our deep dive into the federal government's National Autism Strategy and why it's needed. Just before we start, a trigger warning. We will be discussing mental health and suicide in today's deep dive. At least 200,000 people in Australia are living with autism. I say at least because experts think that number is much higher given how costly and time-consuming it is to get a diagnosis. This week, the federal government released its National Autism Strategy, which aims to improve the lives and outcomes of people on the spectrum. Some critics say we should have had one years ago. So what is it like being an autistic person in Australia? How important is this strategy? And what can we do in our own lives to improve the lives of those on the spectrum? Joining me now is Professor Cheryl Dissanayake. She's a leading autism researcher at Trobe University. Professor, thanks for your time. Look, we will get into the strategy in a little bit, but I did first want to get a better understanding of what life is like for autistic people in Australia right now. And there was one stat that jumped out at me, and that is that there's a 20-year gap when it comes to life expectancy. It is a shocking statistic. Can you tell us why it exists?
Yeah, that's a really sad statistic, but autism often comes with co-occurring conditions. And these are conditions like anxiety, and, anxiety is a close bedfellow with depression. So depression is not at all uncommon in autism. Mental health conditions are very common in autism. And this is also because of life being difficult for autistic people, often, not always, but often difficult for autistic people. Navigating life as a neurodivergent people in a world that was built for neurotypical people can be exhausting, difficult, fitting a square peg into a round hole. Autistic people often experience things like burnout simply as a result of managing not just them being autistic, but these other additional co-occurring conditions that so frequently happen. So lifespan and life expectancy is often reduced as a result.
I wanted to talk as well about employment, which you touched on there. So the latest statistics suggest autistic people are around 8 times more likely to be unemployed than someone who is not disabled. Can you explain to us what it's like for someone on the spectrum trying to access employment? What are some of the barriers that they run into while trying to actually get a job, but then also to keep that job?
That's a great question. There are many barriers. And in fact, since 2015, we've been involved in research into employment and vocational engagement for autistic people. So, for example, it's right at the outset, the advertisement for jobs can often be misleading for autistic people who can be quite literal. So I think we really need to think about representing the job properly that we're advertising for. So that's from the outset. But then there's the interview process, and that can be really challenging. So we always recommend that the questions for interviews, and we do this ourselves in our center, be sent to the applicant beforehand. So because you're really it's not a trick test, right, when you're interviewing someone for a job. So there's no reason why the candidate can't have the questions beforehand to make the interview more accessible for them. Offering a virtual interview can often be helpful. So these sorts of stresses that autistic people often experience in interactions can then be reduced, because a job interview for all of us is very stressful, but it can be off the charts for someone who's already anxious. And as a result of being autistic and then having anxiety, which is so common, the interview can really be quite a threatening occasion for them. So anything we can do to make that more accessible for the person who's autistic, because the autistic person might have all of the skills that job requires and more, and yet, things like that handshake, the engagement in eye contact, all of those things can really limit their success in getting that job. And then once they get the job, and as you heard, that's pretty rare, once they get the job, how do we make that position sustainable for the autistic person? So, for example, we do training around having neurodiverse friendly workplaces so that the physical environment with just minor adjustments can be much more accessible for the autistic person. For example, because of their sensory difficulties, or because of open planned offices that can be noisy and quite distracting. We're moving to these different sorts of ways of working that can be more difficult for autistic people.
Let's talk now about this national strategy. So we've just talked about, mental health issues, the suicide rate, unemployment, access to services as some of the biggest issues for people with autism in Australia. Does the strategy set out to address any of those, especially around things like workplace initiatives? Is the federal government looking to address those issues in this national strategy?
Yes, so one of the focus for CHI in this national strategy is around economic inclusion. How do we benefit from employing autistic people in contributing to our productivity? And that's a very real question. So yes, there is a focus within the national strategy on economic inclusion. There's also a focus on social inclusion, which is also very relevant to the workplace. So, you won't necessarily have your autistic staff engaging maybe in the kind of day-to-day banter and so on. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Having workplaces in which the autistic person can feel settled in and belong in that workplace is really important. These things are so interrelated. We were talking earlier about suicidal ideation and behavior that's common in autism. Well, loneliness contributes to that. So it's not that autistic people don't want to engage, but they have difficulty engaging in the usual way. So making adjustments so that they can engage in the workplace and can contribute in the workplace is really important. And yes, that is a focus in this National Autism Strategy, which is just great to see. The strategy was led by the Autistic Voice. And so that's another really important piece in the development of this strategy.
Yeah, what are some of the other key issues that were raised and thus implemented in the strategy?
So in addition to the economic and social inclusion, there's also a focus on diagnosis and supports and services for autistic people. So really, three very important things captured there. Making diagnoses accessible. We at the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre really push diagnoses as early as possible for children. So we do a lot of work in ensuring that infants and toddlers are monitored for early signs of autism, so that we look at children who have a high likelihood of autism and promote diagnoses for them. But diagnoses are important. Access to diagnosis is important right across the lifespan. And more, we have many adults who are now also being diagnosed. So diagnoses aren't just difficult because of, knowing how to do a good diagnosis. They need to be multidisciplinary. But access to diagnosis can be very difficult, both because of the shortage of clinicians and multidisciplinary teams doing diagnoses, but also because of the cost. So a private diagnosis is very expensive. And so we need to make diagnoses more accessible across the lifespan. And so that will be a focus of the strategy. The other aspect is, once you have a diagnosis, is access to supports and services to make life better, to make sure that that autistic baby, toddler, preschooler, school-age child can access what they need to thrive.
Do you think the strategy misses anything?
Look, that's a really good question. On my first reading, I think it's good. It's ambitious. It needs to be. I think the devil will be in the detail. The next step is to develop, based on the feedback received, an action plan. But the success of this strategy will lie in all levels of government working together to achieve the outcomes for autistic people. And by that, I mean local government, state governments, and the federal government, so that all levels of government are singing from the same page.
I want to ask you before we let you go, Professor, at the end of the day, these are government initiatives. You've said that they're ambitious. There's a lot that needs to go into, cutting red tape and making things accessible for autistic people in Australia. There's no doubt. However, what would your advice be to neurotypical people who are just going about their lives in their communities? How can they make life easier for autistic people in their communities so that, we're doing everything we can on the grassroots level as well?
So I think, first of all, knowing someone is autistic is important, and often autistic people don't self-disclose because of the stigma they receive. So being aware of your own responses to other people, I think, is really important. And acknowledging that there are different sorts of brains and people function differently. And so being open to that, and then making the necessary adjustments to interacting with that person, to making sure that the environment is accessible to that person. Even things like dimming lights. We now have light dimmers on all of our light switches in our center, because we have these fluorescent lights which are very bright and really can be overwhelming. Accepting that autistic people, may require those different accommodations, may require headphones, may require you to slow down a little bit. So reasonable adjustments being made to accommodate autistic people, and in fact, any neurodivergent person is really important. Just being aware of those minor reasonable adjustments, which is often all it takes, and being open to interacting with other people in a different way, and being able to make those accommodations and being open to those accommodations, I think.
Look, the more we learn about it, the more it's clear that there is a lot of work left to be done in this space. And I suppose this national strategy is a step closer to better inclusion for people with autism. Professor Cheryl Dissanayake, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That is all for this morning's podcast. But before you go, I would love it if you could share this episode with someone that you think might like it. You can also check out more of what we do on socials. Instagram is @TheBriefingPodcast, and we're Listener Newsroom on TikTok and YouTube. That's LISTNR. Feel free to get in touch with us via DM as well if you have any thoughts about today's ep or a great story tip you'd like us to investigate. I'm Sasha Barbagat. See you next time.
Listener.